In this series of videos, we will be going through different chapters of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. This book explains how to use Java language to create Spring Boot web applications. A prerequisite for these videos is to know how to use Java, and that's it. In the book, we will be using IntelliJ IDE, Integrated Development Environment, but you can also use your own favorite IDE, like Eclipse. It's just that certain steps will probably be different, but the code that is being explained will remain the same. So in this video, we will just go quickly through what this book covers and how it should be used. If you don't have the book, it doesn't matter because you can also simply use videos, and book can be just an additional options if you decide to get it. So let's just go quickly through the content of the book, which is the content of the videos that will follow. So the first chapter is a quick start chapter, which describes how to quickly start developing Spring Boot web application. This chapter will explain how to install Java and how to install IntelliJ IDE. Then it explains how to create Spring Boot project by using either IntelliJ Community Edition, which is free, or Ultimate Edition, which is paid. Throughout this course, we will be using Ultimate Edition, but the differences are minimal, so you are free to use whatever approach you want. After creating a project, we will show how to run the project. This is very simple. You just have to click on a green arrow once the project is created, and to get something to display, we have just added this additional line to already created Java class, in this case demo application Java class. So this is how project will look like once created. And then we will create another simple project, but this time it will be a web application, because this was initially just a console application, because all of the tutorials will be actually a web application. So here we specified steps how to create a simple Spring Boot web application, in this case by adding a single controller class with a single endpoint, so that application can be accessible through a web browser. So this covers the first chapter. In the second chapter, we will cover the most important terms which are used while developing Spring Boot web applications. So these are terms related to a project, terms like Spring Initializer, which is a web application which is used to create initial structure of your project, Spring Boot starters, which are Java dependencies that are added to Maven, POM.xml, or Gradle files in order to include different components that you want to use in your web application. And the Spring Boot project is a Spring Boot project that is created after we specify all these, and then it is what we are using inside IntelliJ to create our code. Then we will cover some most used types of Java classes, which are controller class, service and repositories, or controller and classes that hold data and are used to exchange data between these classes. And then we will also explain, in case of DTO, in more detail how DTO is being used in different places. So this second chapter is more focused on theory and less on code, even though there will be some examples of the code, as we can see here, but none of the tutorials create complete projects, just code samples. After this term, we will start with additional chapters, and all of these chapters that now follow are actually, each of these chapter is a separate simple Spring Boot web application which demonstrates specific functionality that is being discussed. So for instance, this chapter, Assign Profile to Class, is a standalone Spring Boot web application that is being created from scratch and which demonstrates how to use profiles to define which classes to use in inside the application. So we will use this example to show how each of the tutorials is actually being structured. So each tutorial starts with a chapter title, which gives a short description what this tutorial is about. It then follows with more elaborate description of what is actually being done in this tutorial, what is the purpose of this tutorial, which functionality is being explained, and a little more detail about that functionality and different ways in which it can be used. Then we will follow, then each tutorial will have application schema, which shows all the files that are being used inside the tutorial. So all the files that either we need to create, in which case they will be shown in gray boxes, or all the files which might be generated, which will be shown in white boxes. So this schema shows all the files that we will be used and also how they are interconnected. So in this schema we see that we will be using web browser to type these two different URLs, and then it shows how they will be mapped to different and rerouted to different controllers, different Java classes, and it also shows that we are using application properties file. Each of these, you can click on each of these Java classes to see how their code. So this is the code of the MyController1 Java class, and in this the parts of the code that are actually being explained in the tutorials will usually be highlighted like this. Since in this tutorial we are explaining how to use profiles and classes, we have highlighted this part because this is actually the part that is being demonstrated by this whole code. And in this example, this is this part. So you can click on each of these classes, or in this case on the application properties files, to see its content, and highlighted parts are the most important parts that are being discussed in the current tutorial. Then you will have this table which shows what dependencies, Spring Boot starters, you need to select when creating a Spring Boot application, because without these you would not be able to access all the functionality that is needed for tutorial to properly work. These Spring Boot starters are discussed here, and they are nothing more than dependencies that will be included in the POM.xml file, because we are using Maven build and Maven works with this kind of dependencies. So in this case we are only using one dependency, Spring Web, which will result in a POM.xml file which will have this part added to it. POM.xml file is included in every Spring Boot application as shown here, and depending on the dependencies it will only have a different content. Okay, so after this table, which tells you which dependencies needs to be selected when we're creating the application, then we have the actual procedure in more detail of what everything that needs to be created for the application. So in our case, we are creating a project with this name, and if you click here, you will get information on how to create project, either by using IntelliJ or Community Edition. So these are these chapters here which show how to create project. So the procedure tells us to create a project and everything that needs to be done after the project is created. In this case, we need to edit file application properties because we need to define a profile. We need to create package controllers, and then we need to create following classes. Again, you can click on each of these links to get to the class or file in question and see its content. Because as you are creating the classes, you can simply click on it and then use this name to create it in IntelliJ, and then simply select the code, copy, and then paste into IntelliJ. So after you have followed all these steps, you will get a complete Java application, Spring Boot application, which might look like this. So in our case, we created a controllers package, 3 Java classes, and also edited application properties file. And once this is done, we can run our application by pressing this green button, which will run the run configuration. After the application is, so after you follow all these steps, you will get to the results subchapter, which tells us how to test our application. Here it is shown that you simply have to start a web browser, type this URL, and this is what you should expect your application to return if everything was done correctly. In every tutorial, you can quickly go to results section by clicking on the results, and here you can see how your application would actually behave when it is created. And one other thing are these hyperlinks. Those assigned with G letter symbolizes GitHub repository. So if you don't want to go through these steps manually and copy paste all these classes manually, what you could do is go to GitHub repository like this, and then simply clone the repository that is assigned to this tutorial to IntelliJ. This is also a possibility. And some of the tutorials will also have this symbol here, and it is a reference that is being used to create this tutorial. So these are web pages that discuss functionality that is being explained in the tutorial, so that you can have, if you want, additional information about the functionality being discussed. So we have now covered. So what we have now discussed will be true for all these tutorials that follow. They will all have the same structure: title, explanation, schema, Spring Boot starters that need to be included, procedure to manually create application, and then results section to show how to test application, how the final project will look like, and how your POM XML should look like. Now we will go very quickly through all those chapters just to see everything that is actually included in this book. So in chapter 3, basic functionality, we are discussing some basic functionality like profiles, which allow you to define which classes or application properties will be included into your application. We are talking about application properties files, which use different properties which are needed to configure different components of your Spring Boot application, like on which port your application will be listening, setting up database connection, setting up logging, and other things. We will then discover auto-wired functionality, which is used to inject instances of classes and interfaces you can work with. And we will also explain what is a service layer, how to create services. These are Java classes that contain your business logic and represent the core of every Spring Boot application. All the other classes like controllers, repositories, entities or DTO are just there to serve these service classes. Then we have a chapter 4, which is dedicated to the controllers. These are Java classes that accept HTTP requests. They communicate with the front end. So in this chapter, we'll be talking about annotations which are used to tell Spring Framework that a class is a controller class. These are these two annotations. Then we will be discussing endpoints, so methods inside the controller which are supposed to accept incoming HTTP requests. So different annotations that can be used to define for which URL to activate those endpoints, how to return different types of data from the endpoints, either text, HTML, timeleaf, or JSP, or how to download maybe an Excel file. Then we will be discussing how to read request parameters inside the endpoints by using different approaches like setters and mappers, and also how to read HTML form if HTTP request has been generated from an HTML form. In chapter 5, we will be focusing on the JSON because in most cases, front end will communicate with our backend Spring Boot application by exchanging JSON strings inside HTTP request body. So inside this chapter, we'll show how to deserialize and serialize these requests. To deserialize means when front end sends a JSON request, we need to deserialize it. In other words, convert it into Java object so that our service layer can work with Java objects. And these are different annotations that can be used to map between JSON properties and the Java properties. And we will also show how to serialize Java objects back into JSON strings in order to send them back to the front end over the network. In chapter 6, we will do exactly the same as here, but when working with XML files, how to serialize those, convert XML strings into Java objects, or how to serialize Java objects into XML strings. In chapter 7, we will be talking about object mapping. Object mapping is used inside service layer to map between DTOs and entities, because service layer receives DTOs, data transfer objects, from the controller. Then it needs to map them into one or more entities because service layer works with entities. And then once it makes calculations or receives additional entities from repository and database, it needs to map those entities back into one or more, back into resulting DTO. In chapter 8, we will be focused on using databases. So that means how to use entity Java class, which is a data Java class, which is used to store data that should be stored in the database or is retrieved from the database. So each entity class relates to a single database table. And in order to work with those classes and in order to tell Spring Framework how to map that class and its properties to database table and columns, we can use these different annotations and approaches. Then we will show how to specify connections to different types of databases. And these connections will go into our application properties files. For each database, these connections are different, which is why they need to be covered separately. Then we will be talking about more complex, about relationships between entities, or in other words, relationships between tables in a database, different types of relationships as covered here. Then we will cover finder methods. So these are methods that go into repository classes, which allows us to get entities from the database without having to work with SQLs or database table. So finder methods are one way a repository can communicate with the database. Another way are JPQL queries, which allows us also to query database, and they are more powerful than finder methods. And then we will also show how to use native query for a repository to communicate with database. Native queries use SQL, and they have the most functionality compared to Finder methods and JPQL, but they require you to know SQL. In other words, Finder methods and JPQL are trying to keep everything inside the Java language. In other words, to do Java, to use Java language as much as possible when accessing database. But native queries do not use Java language. Instead they use pure SQL. So this in chapter 9 we will create some demo applications, and the purpose of these demo applications is to show how all these different functionalities previously covered can be used together to create a fully functional application that do some useful work. So in this demo application we will show how to use databases together with entities, and and object mapping and controllers, and to see how all of these things can be put together. In the appendix we will be covering different technologies which can be used while creating Spring Boot application, but are not directly related to coding. For instance, that might be a different libraries like Lombok, which allows us to more easily create entities. It also explains how to use different functionalities within IntelliJ that might be useful, like copying projects using different tools inside IntelliJ, how to create, for instance, a jar file if we want to deploy our application to another server, and how to use developer tools. It also shows, this appendix also contains some additional information on how to use different databases, how to use their clients, maybe to create users or tables, and how to view already created databases and tables. Chapter 11 will cover most common errors that might occur while creating Spring Boot applications and how to resolve those errors. So it will say what to do when you get this message, why this message might appear, and what might be the solution that you can try to use to resolve the error. Chapter 12 is a summary chapter which contains everything that has been previously discussed, but these chapters are not organized as a separate Spring Boot project. Instead, they will simply contain code snippets so that you can more easily find what you need when you need to work something on the Spring Boot application. And that's about it. You can jump to summary by using this link, which currently doesn't work, but if it would work, it would get you to the summary chapter so that you can more easily find the code snippets that you are interested in.